Welcome everyone to tonight's event. PC. I'm pleased to introduce you to the remarkable Rachel Taketa, our guest speaker for tonight's event. Rachel's journey as the Industry Document Library Processing and Reference Archivist at the University of California, San Francisco is awe-inspiring. Rachel has dedicated over 18 years to her role at UCSF, showcasing her unwavering commitment to preserving valuable information. Her expertise in archiving and data science is truly remarkable. She has contributed significantly to publications, shedding light on critical issues like the opioid crisis and the tobacco industry's actions to neutralize Surgeon General's reports. Notably, Rachel's recent appearance at the Everlost Summit, where she discussed the UCSF Johns Hopkins University Opioid Industry Documents Archive, earned her the People's Choice Award. Her engaging and informative presentation left an indelible mark on the audience. But before we dive into Rachel's insights, let's quickly review some guidelines for tonight's Zoom event. Please keep your microphones muted and cameras turned off during the presentation to minimize distractions. Feel free to use the chat feature for questions and comments, and we'll address them during the Q&A session later. Now, without further ado, let's give a warm virtual welcome to the incredible Rachel Taketa.
Thank you, Missy. It's wonderful to be here. I'm really excited to talk to you guys about my digital archive tonight. So I'll try and get through these slides hopefully quickly. There's a lot of information, but hopefully I can take questions. So here we go. So my presentation I titled Digital Archives Save Lives, and it's very dramatic, but I really believe that. I believe that the information that I help acquire and preserve really does translate into better health outcomes for the public, and that translates into saving lives ultimately. So just here to talk about preserving documents for public health. And let's see. So just a little introduction. I am one of 5 on staff for the Industry Documents Library. We actually just added one more person. We used to be 4 for about a good 15 years. It's just this very small staff. We're small but mighty. And I have a director, Kate Tasker, that sort of does the strategic plans and the overall finances and grants and running the archive. And then I do all of the processing and reference work, and then we have 2 developers that help us with our website, and then we now have a program coordinator that sort of helps us oversee all of our timelines, and she loves smart sheets, and she she wrangles our project together for us. Like Missy said, I've been at the Industry Documents Library for a little over 18 years. I've actually been at UCSF for about 30 years. I started as a programmer and in medical billing. I was an older student when I started my MLIS journey. I had small kids, and I was in my early 30s when I went to San Jose State. So I love this school, and I was really attracted to the distance learning model that was just being piloted in the early 2000s. So they used like Blackboard for parts of the online lecture, and then we had to come in person, I think like 5 Saturdays every semester or something like that. I was very lucky in that I was hired at the Industry Documents Library right out of school, right after I graduated. So it's really the only archive job I've ever known, which is good and bad. But I've been here ever since, and I love it. So I'd really just like to introduce you today to my archive, tell you sort of how it began and where it's going. It's a pretty interesting digital archive. It's a bit different than a lot of other digital projects out there, not only really in scope, but in the mission. So I'm a part, or the Industry Documents Library is a part of our larger UCSF Library's archives and special collections. We have a particular focus, on commercial determinants of health, and really how corporations shape our environment, for the good or the bad. So let's just get into the introduction of the library. So what is the Industry Documents Library? You know, the Industry Documents Library is it's a digital portal to over 18 million documents created by industries which influence public health, and it's hosted by the UCSF Library. So when I talk about industries influencing public health, I specifically mean influence like through manipulative marketing and research conducted to create a doubt about the harms of the products, and sort of how companies influence legislation and regulatory actions meant to protect public health, sort of like smoking bans, or maybe, the addition of nutrition labels. The companies that create products like tobacco or cigarettes, or the sugar industry really, fight long and hard to prevent some of these regulatory actions from happening. And so my hope is that the Industry Documents Library really helps to reveal what's known as the commercial determinants of health. Really how companies shape our physical and social environments. So our researchers use our archive to investigate, things like the advertising and marketing efforts of large corporations. They look at the root causes of non-communicable diseases like obesity and heart and lung disease. We collect these internal files of these corporations. And so, the IDL, basically contains evidence in a company's own words, basically, of what they knew about the risks of their products, when they knew it, and what they did or didn't do about it. We are home to what's become to be known as the Truth Tobacco Industry Documents Library. This is sort of our flagship archive. It started 20 years ago, and a fair amount of researchers know about our tobacco documents. But we're also a home to the opioid, chemical, drug, food, and fossil fuel industry document archives. So we have expanded over the years, and our URL is at the bottom right there. And you can get to our site 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So when you come to our homepage, you'll come to the Industry Documents Library's sort of all industries page. And so here is where you will find all of our industry collections. Each one has its own page. There's the menu across the top in red up there. And then this is the way you can search across all industries. I mean, you'd be surprised how many people and organizations, like trade organizations and chemicals and ingredients, sort of come up in documents across all of these different corporations. Like, for instance, if you put in a search for benzene, you're going to get documents hits across every industry archive we have. If you need a full overview of all the features of our site, there's the Take a Tour button at the top, right in the middle, and that'll just sort of do a quick click-through tutorial, which would introduce you to the different website functions. And then at the bottom, there's an Ask Us link, and that just takes you to an email page that basically will just come to me. So I'll get any questions that come through that Ask Us link. All right, so what will you find in the IDL? Well, it's really what you would find inside the file cabinets and the hard drive of any large corporation. It's basically like if you took their hard drives and, or their email servers and their, physical file cabinets and like dumped them on the floor. That's basically what I have in our archive. It's, internal memos, letters, marketing plans, board minutes, a lot of scientific studies. We have a fair amount of audio and video materials, maybe about 6,000 audio and video recordings that we actually upload to Internet Archive and use them as our hosting site. And then we pull the videos and the audio files back into our site to stream using an API. So it's also up on Internet Archive. We have just 2 access points, basically. On the right here is just an example of one of our most famous documents. So it's an excerpt of a memo called Smoking and Health Proposal. And this was prepared by marketing executives in 1969 by the Brown and Williamson Tobacco Company. And in it, I just pulled this one page where it explains, there's a quote that says, "Doubt is our product, since it's the best means of competing with the body of fact that exists in the mind of the general public. It is also the means of establishing a controversy," end quote. And so this doubt is our product line sums up one of the main tactics that the tobacco industry used at the time, and they still do, which is to create doubt about the science around health harms. And this is one of the main reasons that we collect these documents and make them available, right? Because researchers have found that what a company says internally is often very different from what they say publicly. And so that's really what we're trying to show here with these documents. All right, so where do the documents come from? We get these documents from a variety of sources. Mainly, we get them through litigation. So, anytime companies are sued, like the tobacco companies were sued in the 90s, or the opioid manufacturers are getting sued currently, we get large tranches of documents through litigations like that. But we also get documents from lawyers, from law firms. Journalists give us documents after they've requested them through Freedom of Information Act requests or public record requests. Other libraries and archives have partnered with us to digitize their holdings and then put them in our site so they're searchable. And whistleblowers do come to us and give us documents from their own files about certain companies that they worked for, or we've had a whistleblower at the EPA give us documents. So it's a variety of formats, and of course this means this wide variety of file formats and file structures are a lot to deal with, right? We don't really get paper anymore, which is good and bad, right? We don't have to digitize, pieces of paper anymore, but we also don't always have a say in the specifications for digitization. Sometimes we do, but many times we don't. So we kind of have to take files as they come. For instance, we might get a hard drive with 4 million single-page TIFFs. And all I have is an associated text file that tells me how to stitch these documents together. I've gotten large, 500-page PDFs that contain multiple documents that I need to chop up and separate out. I've gotten long email threads through FOIA requests that have been chopped up with attached documents that were kind of separated out, and I had to figure out how to associate them back together. So it's always interesting and challenging, but definitely challenging. And then just this little research life cycle graphic really just kind of illustrates the sort of the mission of our archive. And it's really just, we collect these documents and add them on our site monthly, basically to change health policy. And how that gets, how that happens is that, the documents are added. We help researchers use the collections, as primary resources for their own papers and publications and media projects. And then we hope that those projects end up getting used as evidence to support changes in policy and regulatory actions. And then those policy changes hopefully translate to better health outcomes for the public. And then when that model is successful, it's noticed by, large law firms, by attorneys generals, who then want to help us get more documents because they want to further that cycle and create better health outcomes. So it becomes like this really circular, iterative life cycle, hopefully. All right, so I want to highlight two of our archive collecting areas tonight, the tobacco industry documents and the opioid industry documents. And these two, really, they're the largest of our industry archive collecting areas, but they also happen to be sort of the oldest and the newest, the tobacco being the oldest and the opioids being the newest. So tobacco is our largest archive to date still, about 14 million documents. The tobacco documents were a model for the acquisitions that followed. So we started getting documents in the 90s. And because we had a lot of practice getting these documents over the next 20 years, this really became a model for not only how we acquire documents in litigation, but sort of how researchers can then use these documents in our archive as evidence to create policy change, like that life cycle little model I showed you. So the tobacco documents give a glimpse into the inner workings of the tobacco industry, really at the height of its power and influence. We're talking like the 1950s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, really when it was there, they were really on top of their game back then. And so this insight's crucial for people working in public health and tobacco control, because it helps them learn how a large industry operated and how it tried to influence the public and policymakers. So, I mean, these documents are old. Some of them are very old. Even, these documents are 20 years old at least, but many of the tactics that they used are still relevant today. And that's what's really helpful about this archive. Users can study past marketing campaigns or respond to current marketing strategies, or read about people and third-party organizations that are involved in the tobacco industry to understand, its network of influence. So even though these are older documents, they're still very relevant for today in many ways and still used. So the first documents came to our library in a box, a little box sent to a UCSF professor named Stan Glantz. They were sent by an anonymous whistleblower that was a paralegal copying documents from the Brown and Williamson Tobacco Company. And this was in like 1994. And the box only had his address, and then the return address was simply said Mr. Butts, which if you're older like me, you remember that there was a cartoon strip called Doonesbury. And there was a character called Mr. Butts that was a cigarette. And you can see on the Nation cover on the left here of the slide, that's Mr. Butts. And so that's who sent the documents at the time. So Professor Glantz got this box and started looking through these documents that were sent to him by who knew who. And he, quickly realized that these were really important documents. They were from the early 1950s all the way through the 80s. And they were primarily internal memos and scientific studies that had been secretly copied from an ongoing lawsuit. And they were about the addictive nature of nicotine, really, and the health effects of tobacco smoke. And really, as he started reading them, he realized they clearly showed that Brown and Williamson was aware of the dangers of smoking, but they were continuing to deny these dangers to the public. So he, wanted to do something with these documents. And while copies had been sent to other public health experts and journalists as well as him, nobody wanted to put these out for research or put them up publicly because the tobacco industry was very litigious and very intimidating, and nobody really wanted to deal with it, right? So he decided to go ahead and work with the UCSF library to make them available to researchers. So we put he put them, and our librarian put them in the archives reading room and told researchers that they were there. And we had tons of people try and come see these documents. So many so that Brown and Williamson ended up suing my university to try and take the documents back. But thankfully, the judge in the case decided, on the side of the university and the public that, these documents were already out there and that they were in the public interest to be able to research these documents. So they needed to stay public. So we, Brown and Williamson lost that case and we were able to keep the documents public. And so then what our library did was make them available to researchers on CD-ROM because it was like 1995. So that's how it was dispersed to researchers, a nice CD-ROM. And then from there, they decided to put them up online, which was a very new thing for the library. In 95, there was not a lot of online yet. So we were one of the first sort of online archives at that time. I mean, during this time, the reason the box of documents was even sent to Dr. Glantz at UCSF was because the tobacco companies were being sued all over. I mean, most of the states had started some kind of lawsuit against the tobacco company. And then in 1997, Minnesota was the first state to settle with the tobacco companies, and their attorneys general, Hubert Humphrey III, decided to include a requirement that the companies had to make the documents disclosed during the lawsuit available to the public. And this was groundbreaking. Most big lawsuits, once they settle, the documents that are given over during discovery get sealed or destroyed or given back to the companies themselves, because a lot of them are internal documents that these companies don't want to see the light of day. But, Hubert Humphrey decided to make that document disclosure a must in the settlement. And that was really groundbreaking. And then in 1998, the following year, the Master Settlement Agreement resolved all the remaining lawsuits with 46 states. And it also included that requirement for documents to be made public. This was the largest civil litigation in US history up till that point. And we were able to get those documents. So it was huge for us as well. So that started our tobacco industry documents area. We now have more than 45 collections. Many of them are duplicative or they overlap, but it's a very large body of potential research. A lot of papers and publications have been written using these documents as a primary source. We have, I think, over 1,000 peer-reviewed papers and publications, and some films, some media projects, blogs that were written using these materials. And research in this particular archive has actually spawned a research methodology all its own called snowball searching. So there's a tobacco documents methodology now, which is great. All right, now it's on to the Opioid Industry Documents Archive, which is something that has just started in the past 2 years at my archive. So after 20 years of tobacco industry documents launching, we launched the Opioid Industry Documents. And the Opioid Industry Documents Archive was actually, of course, a direct result of the tobacco documents acquisition model. So we used the tobacco documents and the success of those archives as the justification for starting the opioid documents. The Attorney General's offices in Massachusetts, Minnesota, and New York all pushed for document disclosure in their own states' cases against the opioid manufacturers. They had looked at the tobacco model and they saw how successful that was. And so they decided to try and put the document disclosure clause in their own states' cases. So UCSF and Johns Hopkins University partnered in 2020 to house the millions of documents coming out of these opioid settlements. And this public archive was actually created and funded in part through settlements of public interest lawsuits by the states. So we had a lot of help by the attorneys generals of those states. And so the objective of our opioid industry documents is to develop an understanding of how the opioid manufacturers, distributors, and pharmacy chains contributed to the opioid crisis. We have 13 collections now available. 3 of them are fairly large right now, and the rest are smaller but growing. We have a collection of Mallinckrodt documents, about 1 million documents. Mallinckrodt was one of the largest generic opioid manufacturers in the United States. We have a collection on McKinsey & Company, which is the consulting firm, a huge consulting firm. McKinsey did consult with opioid manufacturers about their marketing and sales strategies. One of the issues with McKinsey is that they were also consulting with the FDA at the same time and leveraging their work with the FDA, for their work with opioid manufacturers. So that was a bit of a conflict of interest. And then we also have a collection of about over 1 million documents in Insys Therapeutics, which was a company that manufactured a fentanyl spray. And it was supposed to be used for, cancer patients and breakthrough cancer pain. So sort of end of life type pain management. But instead, Insys Therapeutics salespeople were, taught to be pretty ruthless and to, sell that fentanyl spray for pretty much any pain at all. And I'm not sure if anybody has seen Pain Hustlers on, I think it's Netflix. So that movie or that limited series was based on Insys Therapeutics company, so the salespeople. So that's directly based upon this company's papers. So the attorneys generals acted as an intermediary between the company's lawyers and us as the repository to help us get all of these documents. Insys Therapeutics was already in bankruptcy, so there was no more company when we got the documents, which meant that there was no company to redact the documents. So we were handed 5 million documents that were completely unredacted. And that was a huge issue for us getting these documents up. We had to figure out how to redact 4 or 5 million documents at scale with limited funding. And so that's been an ongoing project for the last couple of years, really. Presently, the Opioid Industry Documents Archive contains about 3 million documents. And these are, documents we've acquired through lawsuits, court records, and news media investigations. We're in the process of acquiring millions more next year, because there's always new settlements and new companies coming at us. And now that we are collecting these, the attorneys generals of all the different states know we are. And so they're trying to get us more documents, which is great, but it's also a lot of work. And one of the new features we've actually added, because this is getting so large, is a beginner's area. So if you're new to the archive and you're very overwhelmed, we've added a little getting started area. And here's our get started area, really. It's just an area where some of our archivists have created research guides for each collection. And it's really to give novice researchers tips for starting out, because it is overwhelming to just get dropped into 3 million documents or 5 million documents and not really know what to do with them. So we've learned from our past, tobacco archives, where it took people a long time to get up to speed with how to research in these different materials. And so with the opioids, we've really been able to build upon our past archive experience and provide research guides and, lists of key documents, news stories about the opioid epidemic, really lots of content to provide context and help for new users. And then this is just one, document. It's an example from one of our opioid collections. It's a pretty inflammatory example that I like to show people. This is a page from a presentation by an advocacy group, which most of these advocacy groups really are industry funded. This was called the Imagine the Possibilities Pain Coalition. And this is their presentation to Janssen Pharmaceuticals about how to get the marketing message about chronic pain and pain management out to kids and their coaches, and kids as young as elementary school level. So they did actually have marketing plans to do an outreach to elementary schools around opioids. All right, so, there have been a lot of challenges with the Industry Documents Library over the years. So I just wanted to note a few of them for you. Digital preservation. So one of the many challenges of having an all digitized or all digital online archive is that storage of many copies of terabytes of data is a lot of money. It's hard to manage, right? The archive may potentially include 30 million documents. And so, it's terabytes and, terabytes of data. How do you maintain this? How many copies do you keep? How do you find the money to continually store this and make it available? For best practices, there are a ton of resources about, digital preservation and best practices, but we found over the years that many didn't fit our specific use case or our archive model. And we've had to kind of go it alone and create some of our own best practices. We have a preference for open source. It goes with our mission. And so we use a Solr backend, MariaDB. We use WordPress for our content. Open source is great, but it also requires expertise, right? It requires IT expertise, which means, and developers, which of course translates into money. So you have to have the money to hire the expertise to use the open source and to craft the open source platforms for you. And then certain file formats don't always play well with our archives, reader. We have to manage and preserve a wide variety of file formats. And, we've had questions like, how do you serve up a copy of Excel when you have a PDF viewer? How do you save a copy of Excel? Do you just serve up the Excel, spreadsheet zipped up for people? How can you be sure that somebody isn't going to take that and use it in a way that was not thought of or taken out of context? There's a lot of questions around the use of all of our file formats that we've sort of had to try and answer on our own. And, we're still trying to figure it out. We haven't gotten a great answer yet, but so far we just keep lots of copies of everything, and we preserve the originals, and then we have use copies, and then we have working copies, and we have a lot of copies in storage, and it is quite a bit of money, but we haven't yet figured out how to sort of streamline that. Another challenge is metadata. So when you get millions of documents, you have to assess CSV files with over 1 million rows. And I have yet to find any program that opens large CSV files well. We do have item level description, which is great for findability, but it's very costly and very time consuming to produce. The use of metadata provided through legal discovery is great, because then we get metadata along with the images, so we don't have to produce that item level description, which saves us money in the short run, but then it requires us to map, other people's metadata to our existing schema. And for instance, the opioid documents I'm getting right now, some of them have 130 fields. And I have to try and figure out how to map that to around 30 fields, which is what we use in our schema. So, it becomes complicated. And then, the future directions for our metadata, we're looking to use computational methods and crowdsourcing to help us enhance metadata. But that's, so far we haven't had the time to figure out how to look at these computational methods like natural language processing and named entity recognition, and how to really craft them for our purposes. So it's still sort of out there in the wish list. And then privacy and legal issues, right? Protecting third-party privacy. Making every document available to the public requires the identification and redaction of PII and PHI. Some collections also have documents that were withheld from the court. So we only got the metadata record, like with the tobacco documents. But then once some of these documents are challenged and made public, we have to make sure we keep a record and we keep track of documents that are now public, and we add those. But then what do you do with the existing metadata versus the new metadata? How do you help a researcher challenge confidential designation so that they can see the documents? It's all, there's a lot of evidence trail we have to keep track of. So managing these documents in the legal sphere has also proved challenging. but we've had a lot of successes, right? So we look at analytics, of course, to see how many visitors come to our site, and how many people download our documents, that type of thing. But really the successes, for me anyway, is really in the dissemination of information and scholarship. For instance, a couple of weeks ago, I found that Rob Bonta, who's the Attorney General for California, had actually used some of our fossil fuel industry documents as evidence in the recent lawsuit that California is bringing against the oil industry. So that was a success. It was great news to hear that they'd actually dug through our documents and, you know, found some evidence to add to their complaints. This meant his office is, you know, finding benefit from that document disclosure, and that perhaps once they, you know, their lawsuit runs its course and they settle, if they do, that they may then insert that document disclosure remedy into their own settlement. And that means we might get those documents. So it's, you know, starting to, you know, come full circle. We create partnerships between researchers and journalists, which really creates a pipeline to the public. And it's more of that information dissemination that that's the success. The journalists often synthesize the really dense and reference-laden, papers and peer-reviewed studies. And so that, and the journalists can craft, articles that break it down for the average person to understand. For instance, there was a study recently by one of the UCSF Institutes for Health Policy researchers. They helped us collect some of our sugar industry documents over the years. They did a study using the documents that were focused on how tobacco companies created and marketed what they called hyperpalatable foods, which are like, sugar and carb bombs, basically. But, these are in essence addictive foods. And much like the tobacco products that the companies had, marketed as well. So the study itself is in the Journal of Addiction. But the New York Times writer, Anahad O'Connor, has a relationship with our archive and some of the researchers. And so he picks up that story and, does a story on that study that's in addiction. And, it goes out to a wider public audience. And the same thing has been happening with our opioid industry documents. We have these cross-institutional work groups between UCSF and Johns Hopkins that were created specifically for engagement and communication activities. And so we really try and, foster relationships with journalists and educators and create these partnerships with researchers so that we can get the research out to a wider base and more people will read about them. And then finally, we've had some success around the big data sphere, which is sort of, a newer landscape for us. We're used to researchers, going into our archive, finding, documents to read, downloading the PDF, using that document for, as a reference, in their paper, that kind of thing. But, over the last few years, we've had a lot of interest in by data scientists in our archives, really as data. And, when you have millions of records that are standardized and described at the item level, like we do, data scientists and programmers want to use them as training sets for their algorithms and their AI tools. And in some ways, these partnerships are really beneficial for both parties. We've had a lot of benefit from these data scientists, but we really feel like we need to proceed cautiously. Mostly because I'm not sure yet, what's the danger of our documents being misrepresented if they're stripped down to just their text and they're taken out of context. We as archivists, I don't know about you guys, but I get sort of very protective of my my archives and my holdings, and we collect them for a specific purpose, and it's hard to let them go out into the world and possibly be misrepresented, especially if it's just the text taken stripped down and then used in big computational data sets. So we're hoping to leverage the other parties' AI models to enhance our descriptive metadata. At least we can have them help us with that. By participating in archives as data projects, it's really helped us to think more about how we craft our metadata and how we can improve it for sharing with other entities. And then some of the image extraction projects that have been going on with our documents have yielded a database of images that in turn we have been able to use in outreach and social media efforts. So far it has been some really good partnerships and some successes, but we are proceeding cautiously. And finally, I just wanted to wrap this up before, if anybody has questions, but we are on some of the socials. I know that's still a bird up there, but I guess it should say X now, but we're still on Twitter for good or for bad. We're also on LinkedIn. We just started on Instagram. I'm trying to figure that out, and Mastodon. And if you want to subscribe to our newsletter, there's the link. And we send out announcements maybe once a month about new documents that we're posting and maybe new, workshops or things of that nature. And so, yeah, we'd love to hear from you guys. And if anybody has any questions, please let me know. Thank you.
Rachel, that was fabulous. Thank you so much.
Oh, thanks.
That was really wonderful. I know we already have 2 questions so far in the chat. I don't know if you want to read them or there. I know we have one from Kat first. Kat says, I'm really interested in working in archives like this, but I fear that I may not have much experience in the medical arena. How important is it to be a domain, a domain expert to work in an archive like this, and what skills do you look for that could leverage for that lack of domain experience?
Yeah, I didn't have any experience either, honestly. You just learn on the job, really. You end up reading a lot of the documents just when you're processing them. It's harder nowadays when I'm getting millions of documents. I tend to have to do a more of an overview with visualization tools, but you still end up getting the flavor of these documents. I do a lot of research around specific companies. So I read books, or I try and read magazine articles or books or some background when I'm, taking in a specific collection, like with the opioid documents. I read a lot of the books around opioids, like Empire of Pain, The Hard Sell, stuff that really told you about what these companies were doing. And so that really does help with content expertise, but I didn't have any medical experience or any domain experience either. It's really all on the job. And it's just, it's interesting. This stuff's interesting. It's easy to research because it's very interesting. Contents. Oh, the contents of this archive are very important. What's being done to build awareness of the archive and its contents? Thank you. I think they're really important as well. We are doing presentations like this, but we're doing them with attorneys generals and at the state level with lawyers. We have archivists that are helping to do outreach to educators, not even college, but high school level. We're looking to integrate some of this archives into curriculums at medical schools and pharmacy schools. So yeah, it's hard, it's hard to know sort of where to start. But I think, that's sort of what we've been doing, mostly just trying to do workshops and presentations and get the word out to journalists who can get the word out further.
Alana wants to know, what are the visualization tools you use?
Yeah. So right now, I'm sorry to say, I use a very proprietary platform. It's mostly in the legal field. It's an e-discovery platform called Everlaw. And a lot of lawyers and legal companies and legal firms use it. There's another one called Relativity. Those are the 2 biggies. So because we're getting so many documents out of directly from lawyers out of the litigation sphere, putting them back into an e-discovery platform is pretty seamless. And then Everlaw has amazing visualization tools to use. I haven't tried my hand at any open source visualization stuff yet, unfortunately.
Thank you. And then Rebecca wants to know, is your work pretty evenly split between reference and processing, and how do you balance those aspects?
Yeah, well, so for the opioids industry documents, I'm lucky in that the partnership with Johns Hopkins really helps me out in the reference area, because there are 2 or 3 archivists on their side, on Johns Hopkins side, that are dedicated content and outreach experts. So I get to field a lot of questions over to them for the opioids documents. And I just mostly do the processing now for them. For all of the other industries, it's just me. I don't have any help. And so I have to, I think it's not evenly split. I do much more processing than I do reference. I don't tend to get a ton of reference questions overall. They're always by email, once in a while by phone, but maybe 1 or 2 a week. Because most people that are, researching in our archive, they either come and they, get what they need, they find a few documents and they leave, or they're doing a huge research project, and that's when they come to me and ask, the harder questions, like, I'm searching for this and this, how would I do a proximity search to find documents that are this, because there's millions of documents to get through, and it becomes really difficult to craft relevant searches. So I fortunately don't get a whole lot of reference questions.
Carolyn wants to know, how does your organization offer internships or volunteer opportunities?
I wish we did. We don't really right now. We do have some internships for high school students on the computational side, like with our software developers. But we haven't had any internships or volunteer opportunities lately in the archives itself. And that's really just because UCSF doesn't ever want unpaid internships or volunteer. So we can only offer paid internships and volunteer opportunities. And so far, we've never had the funding to be able to do that. So it's sort of a catch-22.
Let's see, we have Julie wants to know, similar to Rebecca's question, what does prioritizing processing look like when the metadata is so detailed? You answered this bit, but do you ever need to go back and redo metadata based on new discoveries in a big project way?
Yes. So one of the problems with getting, millions of documents from the tobacco litigations early on was that the tobacco companies themselves provided the metadata. And at the time, it worked for us because we didn't have any money to also do that, indexing. So we had to take the metadata as it came. And, 13 million documents later, that's how the metadata is. And once we started getting other industry archives going, we had to stick with that metadata schema that had been set up through the tobacco documents. So we were sort of forced to go with metadata that was not standardized, that there's no specific schema or standardization that we follow. And it's not a catalog record, so we don't follow MARC. And it's just, it was its own entity, and it was set up by the tobacco companies early on. And we had to follow that for years because it was just too big to change. So now we've gone back, now that we have opioids coming on, and they have their own set of metadata coming with them, we've had to kind of go back and rethink the entire metadata schema. And if we're going to change things, how do we change things? How do we add fields? If there's, researchers that have been researching in our site for 20 years, is it going to throw them off that we're calling something creator instead of author now? That kind of thing. So it's been a huge rework that we've been working at over the years. And we're still doing it. So it's not done by any means, but yeah, it's a lot.
Phoebe wants to know what courses during your MLIS program at San Jose State were helpful for your job and career, if you can remember, and do you have any classes you wish you had taken?
You know, at the time, I graduated in 2005, and actually the archives track in 2005 was really helpful for theory, you know, so we, you know, processed paper collections, you know, created folders, wrote scope and content notes. My internship at the end of school was with the San Francisco Public Library's history room, and I processed a specific collection for them that, you know, where I, you know, got the right archival boxes and all of this stuff. I do none of this in my job now, none of it, because it's all digitized. But knowing the theory, knowing, you know, all of the stuff I learned about, you know, metadata and scope and content and foldering and how you sort of get a handle on a collection with acquisitions, and that was all still really helpful. It just sort of didn't apply anymore to the digitized, you know, the paper stuff didn't apply to the digitized anymore. But I think, are there any classes I wish I had taken? No, I think at the time there just weren't those digital preservation or more computational analysis or big data project type classes that there are now, probably.
See, we have, are there any other sectors you'd like the industry library to move into?
Oh, totally. I just am not sure I have the bandwidth for any more. I have been on the side collecting firearm industry documents, so gun industry documents. I have about 1 million documents from Remington about their rifles back in the day. And, you know, there's more fossil fuel industry documents I'd love to collect. There's also some researchers that are really interested in the alcohol industry, mostly because they partnered with the tobacco industry for years on marketing campaigns. But I think that would be a really valuable addition as well.
I think we are out of questions. If anyone has any more, feel free to unmute if you don't have time to write it in the chat. But other than that, this has literally been so enlightening and wonderful. Sorry, there I am. So, does anyone have any more questions? You have been literally full of so much information. And oh, let's see, I have 3 new messages. Oh, where does your funding come from? Yes,
yeah.
More questions. I love it.
Funding is all grants, honestly, grant funded. Even though we do get money from the settlements, so it's written into some of the settlements, like the tobacco industry settlements, they wrote in that, you know, a certain amount of money had to go to, you know, the repository and that kind of thing, but we still end up having to then ask for them as grants. So it's sort of weird, but so it's all grant funded, which, you know, is great, but it's also, you know, hard. You kind of have to eat what you kill, so.
All right, I think that's it.
Sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
So what do you've shared a bunch of really cool collections and findings. What is something particularly that you've worked on that you've been really proud of or just excited to find? Is there anything else besides what you've already shown us, which has been incredible?
Yeah, I mean, the tobacco and the opioids documents have taken up most of my time, so they're sort of forefront in my mind. But honestly, there's a small drug industry document archive that's been hanging out on my site since like 2006, and I started that one all by myself. it just never grew very big because there hasn't been any huge lawsuits with other pharmaceutical industries that that produce documents like the opioids litigation. But there's some really good documents in there about, you know, Merck and, you know, Glaxo, SmithKline, and a lot of pharmaceutical companies and, you know, their drugs and how they've marketed them. Really good stuff, but it's small and it hasn't really grown yet. So, but I'm very proud of that little collection. Let's see, outside of SAA, do you belong to any other associations you find to be helpful? I belong to SCA, so the California Archivists. And that's it right now. I was a member of a lot of web archiving committees on SAA for a number of years because I do participate in a lot of website preservation as a companion to our industry documents. But I haven't been on that committee in a while, so. Thanks, everyone. It was great to talk to you tonight. If anybody has any more questions that you think of like next week or something, you can always email me. Just that Ask Us link on the website comes to me.
Yes, and I can make sure when to give you guys her email information if you need it as well. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Rachel. This was wonderful. Seriously.
Yeah, thank you. That was great.
Thank you, everyone, for coming tonight. We enjoyed it so much. And feel free to come back anytime, please. This was so good.
Yeah,
Thank you, everybody.
All right, good night.
All right, have a good night.